Hello again. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of Plenary Session 2, Mayor Reggie Joule. Reggie Joule is currently serving as mayor of the Northwest Arctic Borough. He was born in Nome, and his father was a well-known Inupiat teacher from the village of Point Hope. He served as a state representative from 1996 until 2012 in the Alaska State Legislature. While representing Northwest Alaska in the legislature, Reggie Joule served as Bush Caucus Chairman, Chair of the Alaska Northern Waters Task Force, as well as a member of the House Finance Committee. Reggie currently serves as a commissioner on the Arctic Policy Commission, Alaska Arctic Policy Commission, and was recently appointed to President Obama's task force on climate change preparedness and resiliency. Please join me in welcoming Mayor Reggie Joule.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Hey. Can't see past the light, so I was relying on my hearing. The session today is going to be talking about increased Arctic activity, about some of the infrastructure and investment challenges and opportunities that are there. And this afternoon's speakers, I might mention, in addition to former Lieutenant Governor Mead Treadwell, who will be joining us, and Mikå, we also will be joined a little bit later by Alice Rogoff, who should be landing, hopefully, as we speak. And she'll be jumping in a cab and coming straight over. I'll give you a little bit of a bio on all of them. But what do you think about Edward's afternoon address? I thought that was awesome. Edward put into words so many of the things that we think about as Arctic people. And the building of some of this infrastructure is certainly one of those things, what it all means. What are the opportunities? What's the challenges? And even some of what issues like kind of what's in it for us as people who reside there. And but I'll give a little bit of a bio on our three afternoon speakers. And Mead Treadwell has been up in Alaska, gosh, for a long time. And Mead's been involved in so many different things over his time in our state. Most recently, he was a lieutenant governor. He's been an advocate and involved in the earliest times recognizing Alaska's Arctic and having those discussions as part of Northern Forum. He was a deputy commissioner, actually, for the Department of Environmental Conservation at one time. He was a commissioner and chair of the United States Arctic Research Commission from 2001 to 2010, and helped the Bush administration in developing the current United States Arctic policy, and also was instrumental in making sure that the funding for the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment was accomplished in 2009. So he's currently with Platinum Capital, which is an investment group there in Anchorage, and it's good that he's with them. And I've many occasions I've had the opportunity of traveling with Mead, and he has over the years become very knowledgeable and one of the people that we look to in addressing issues of the Arctic from Alaska. Also joining us this afternoon is someone who I've just had the opportunity to meet, Mikå Mead. Is that correct spelling? Pronunciation, thank you. He's a political analyst and a commentator specialized in polar affairs. Mikå is a managing partner of POLARISK Group, the first market intelligence and political risk consulting risk consultancy dedicated to the Arctic and Antarctic, creator of Arctic Young Leaders Program and co-founder of the French Polar Cluster. He serves on a variety of advisory boards. How do you pronounce that? Likanot? I was way off. I think that's a French pronunciation. He tells me he makes his home somewhere between London and Paris, and I asked him if that was like at about 30,000 feet. Yeah. But he's part of a kind of a think tank group on Arctic issues. He blogs for the CBC Radio, Canada's Eye on the Arctic, and the Arctic Journal for Greenland, and contributes to several think tanks such as Foundations for Political Innovation, the French Arctic Initiative, Geopolitics and Governance, amongst other things. So we will hear from him also. And Alice Rogoff, who will be joining us here shortly, is the publisher and the owner of the Alaska Dispatch Publishing. They recently bought the Anchorage Daily News. In her earlier years, she was Chief Financial Officer for the U.S. News World Report, and also worked at the Washington Post as assistant to the publisher. She was and served in the administration of President Jimmy Carter as special assistant to the Director of Office and Management and Budget. And like Mead, who I did not mention, also received some of their former education from the Harvard Business School. Alice, a few years ago, started the Arctic Imperative, initially in our state. And it was a discussion about building of infrastructure and investment opportunities in the Arctic, and brought with her quite a group of people who could address some of those issues. And more recently, along with President Gripson of Iceland, has been one of the founders of the Arctic Circle. So Mead and Mikå, if you would take your seats, and as they're coming up, you know, one of the things that Edward mentioned, the Northwest Arctic Borough is just south of the North Slope Borough. We're not as big as Minnesota, like the North Slope Borough is. We're as big as Indiana, which is a little bit smaller. We only encompass about a 36,000 square mile area and have about the same population. And all of our communities most of our communities are located above the Arctic Circle. Every single one of the ones in the North Slope are there. But first I will call on, and there's Alice. Welcome. Boy, you made a quick journey from the airport to here.
Great,
it's good to see you.
driver.
But without any further ado, I'll call on Mead Treadwell to open us up.
Well, Mayor Joule, thank you very much, and Rachel, congratulations again on convening a marvelous meeting. You certainly brought a great set of players together, and I'm glad we're back here and there's good continuity. And Alice, welcome. I woke up in Baltimore this morning, changed planes in Chicago around 5 Seattle time, and managed to catch some sleep someplace, so I think I'm going to be alert, but at any rate. Reggie mentioned that I've got some new jobs. Upon leaving the office of Lieutenant Governor, I guess I'm a free man, and I'm doing a lot of work for free and a lot of work for clients that is all geared toward improving the Arctic as an investment, a place to invest, and trying to bring investment to our part of the world, which is something I've tried to do many different ways in my career. And let's just think about the Arctic for a second in terms of what we do for the world. I bring it down to a single sentence. We feed the world, we fuel the world, we protect the world, we connect the world, and certainly if you heard Edward speak today at lunch, we inspire the world. When we feed the world, you can talk about our fish, and the fact that in the Arctic, in the Bering and the Barents, the Gulf of Alaska are two of the world's richest fisheries. And we worked very, very hard to make sure that that is sustainable. When you talk about fueling the world, there's not only that USGS statistic out there that says that 13% of the world's oil to be found, 30% of the world's gas is to be found in this Arctic basin. But even today, if you take a look at the 80 billion barrels that have been produced out of the Russian Arctic, if that number is correct, the 18 billion barrels produced out of the Alaskan Arctic, and what's been produced out of Norway, which I don't have a number on, we've done significant things for fueling the world for a generation now. In terms of protecting the world, we have people here from NORAD, and we play a major role in NATO, and I was communicating back and forth today with some of our leaders on missile defense. And the northern part of the world, if it doesn't, if you need to explain it, get on board an Emirates Airlines jet from SeaTac, fly to Dubai. You'll find yourself flying straight north, actually intersecting the North Pole, coming ashore over Novaya Zemlya in Russia, traveling down. The last 2.5 hours of your flight is over Iran. And if there's any question of a direct route to, in any attack on the United States, whether it's coming from East Asia or whether it's coming from the Middle East, the Arctic is very much involved. And that's why missile defense is where it is, and that's why our bases are where they are. We connect the world. That same airplane flight that I just mentioned, you know, Russia earns about $500 million a year from overflights because of polar air routes. We don't charge in the United States. Canada does charge, but the Arctic plays a significant role in global commerce with aviation and has since the end of World War II. And we are beginning to connect the world more and more with sea routes, and there's a lot to be done there. And then finally, inspiring the world. Again, I only just have to refer back to Edward's remarks, but the number of people who travel to the Arctic to see wilderness, to enjoy wildlife, to appreciate biodiversity, to raft or canoe a river that will go for miles and miles and miles without any other encounter of a human. That value to me is very important. It's one of the reasons why I live where I live, and it's one that I believe we can protect and at the same time produce. Now I'm going to make an assertion. I'm going to make a couple, but first is that our job in the Arctic is to foster investment, because investment means 4 things. It certainly means jobs for the people who live there. And if you look at communities that have the highest suicide rate in the nation, people who are trying to figure out what their future is, we have to do what we can to foster jobs and employment. Edward talked about the royal flush. It has been an investment of billions that has brought us from when I first entered public life in the early 90s as a deputy commissioner in the environment, only 37% of bush villages. In fact, your newspaper, Alice, had just won a Pulitzer Prize called People in Peril. And the question was, there was actually a very pointed editorial written when we took office saying, are these people who just took over Juneau going to pay attention to this? And we got a 20-year, $50 million a year commitment to try to change the situation. Governor Knowles told a story in your hometown, Reggie, in Kotzebue, where he used to say, I want to put the honey bucket in a museum, and a 12-year-old boy raised his hand and said, why do you want to put one in the museum? That's the only place in town with a flush toilet. But the fact is that we have had to induce billions of dollars worth of investment to bring people up to basic health and sanitation standards, and we have more to go. On environmental protection, try very hard for a community of 500 people that needs a jet port, that needs a dump, that needs its own power plant and is not part of a grid. And everything we do with cash in the Arctic, with close to 200 communities disconnected, is to help give people a basic standard of living so they can maintain where they live and protect the environment. And finally, as far as defense is concerned, I think it's very, very important that we foster an investment climate to have the icebreakers, to do the 12 missions the Coast Guard does, to make sure that we are prepared as a nation for a newly accessible Arctic Ocean, because I can guarantee you there are others getting prepared. And does our job include protecting the environment? And the answer is of course. I said here last year, speaking of our new ocean, that if we are not prepared to protect it, we don't deserve to be there. Food security is incredibly important for the residents of the Arctic. I saw one study that said 75% of the diet of people in Western Alaska is food that they either gather or spear or net or shoot. And we have to be very, very respectful as we look at the other major kinds of investment that we protect food security in the North. But given all that, I would argue that our policy as a country needs to be with energy, sustainably, but produce, produce, produce. And as we look at the Arctic Council chairmanship moving to the United States, I hope we keep some of the same emphasis that the Canadian chairmanship has had on sustainable development in the Arctic, on bringing business opportunity to the Arctic, on making this Arctic Economic Council happen and be effective. Because if we don't foster jobs and if we don't foster investment, we're not going to have the kind of Arctic that I believe all of us envision is important. And the other thing to remember is that our diverse resources in the Arctic, the things that help us feed, fuel, protect, connect, and inspire the world, are mostly commonly owned. And our diverse resources are the fountainhead for many industries, whether it's mining or commercial fishing or sport fishing, shellfish aquaculture, subsistence and sport hunting, tourism, or electric power generation. Now, tomorrow I'm hopeful that when the Arctic Policy Group speaks, that Craig Fleener will have a chance to speak. He's the governor's new cabinet-level point person, tip of the spear on Alaska's Arctic policy and making that happen. Craig, are you here? Why don't you just stand up and be recognized? I'm really honored that you could be here. I had a chance to first work with Craig when he was representative to the Arctic Council as a permanent participant from the Gwich'in International Group, and was proud to serve with him in the Parnell administration for most of the last 4 years, and very glad that you've taken on this leadership position. I think you're going to have a few important announcements tomorrow, so stay tuned. But there's another assertion that Alice and I discussed before this that I'd like to make. Besides the fact that our job is to foster investment, the assertion is that that the question of who owns the Arctic and how do we make decisions to allow investment to happen in the Arctic is pretty important. And I would say that Alaska became an owner state out of necessity. If you go back and look at the congressional record and the debates that were happening on whether or not Alaska should become a state, and by the way, for those of you who are residents of Washington, thank goodness for people like Scoop Jackson, who helped us become a state. Because the question, in the end, we almost became a state in 1952, but my mentor, Governor Wally Hickel, loved to remind us that they beat that statehood bill by one vote. And they beat that bill, which had already passed the House of Representatives, and it was recommitted in the U.S. Senate by one vote in 1952. And if you go back and look at the versions of the bill that almost passed in 1952 and what ultimately passed in 1959, there were really two basic changes. One, we went from about 23 million acres of land granted to the state of Alaska, most of it in southeast Alaska, to 103 million acres, and that's made all the difference in the world because we got Prudhoe Bay and we were able to get exploration going maybe ahead of the time the federal government would have done it and get that pipeline in place that Edward talked about and have built an economy. And the second thing that we got was management of our fish and game, which again, if you listen to an elder like Clem Tillion, he will give you chapter and verse about how badly our salmon were being managed before statehood and how sustainably we've been able to keep our fish going after statehood. And those are two very important things that came with statehood. And we can't forget that not only did we get Prudhoe Bay, we got inshore control of salmon fishing and management, we got riverbeds, we got the capability to do a number of different things. And because one of the major issues in the debate about statehood was whether or not the state of Alaska could support itself. And we have supported ourselves by and large, and we've shown capability to manage our resources. There was another element of statehood, and that was the promise of 90% of federal revenues or revenues on federal land that were due to the state. And I see my friend Bud here, and now you've been called out twice in talks. Bud heads the Bureau of Land Management in Alaska, and he's one of our unelected, and I would say very perceptive governors of the state, and controls more land than a governor does. And the interesting thing is that we're a beneficiary of a trust relationship with the federal government, where 90% of the revenue on federal land comes to the state of Alaska to help do the kinds of investments that I talked about. Now, we sued in the early 1990s when large set-asides happened, and as beneficiary, and the result of that lawsuit was it was not known, and the judge basically threw up his hands and said, well, I guess that 90-10 is not part of your statehood compact, even though the state's position is, last I heard, is that it still is. But we don't know what's enforceable with the compact, and that's something that ultimately needs to be ironed out, and I'd challenge, because this is sponsored in part by a law school, I'd challenge you to help us on that. Governor Walker said the other day he wants to present a $2 billion invoice to the federal government after some announcements the president's made about ANWR and others. But either way, I'd say we have to work this out. Today in Juneau, there's a meeting of a Citizens Advisory Committee on federal areas, and it's a watchdog that has been set up by the legislature. A third of the members are appointed by the Senate, the House, and a third by the governor to make sure that we get what's promised under statehood, under ANILCA, under ANCSA, because I don't think we are. And I can name navigable waters disputes we've had with the federal government, the Wild case, the Sturgeon case most recently. We lost Glacier Bay in the Supreme Court, which had to do with management of our fisheries. Access issues, including the King Cove Cold Bay Road, the situation right now on GMT1, CD5, access in the 40-mile land revenues, where frankly, if you are the beneficiary of 90% of what your neighbor, the federal government, does, wouldn't it be nice to be able to plan on the revenues that you're getting? And we don't see that as yet. Development of ANCSA lands. I mean, some of the major leases that you'll hear about that ConocoPhillips has been working are on private land in the National Petroleum Reserve, Alaska. But the private landowners and the state can't just work it out. The federal government needs to be there and understand that we have to make investments as well. And there are other issues. You can be for or against the Pebble Mine, and I know many people are on one side or the other of that issue, but the idea of the EPA trump card to just rule state land, which we selected for resource development, to rule it worthless, is a very, very difficult position to be in. And after the president's announcement about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge last week, I know many Alaskans are concerned that what has actually happened here is we're being set up for a debate over ANWR, which obviously the president doesn't have the votes in Congress to set ANWR aside as a wilderness. But as an Alaskan, I'm very afraid we're being set up for an Antiquities Act determination by the president where he's just going to do it anyway with a stroke of his pen. And that, to me, would be not what I call sustainable development and not what I call listening to the people who live here. So there are a number of practical suggestions that I think will come out of this meeting happening in Juneau this weekend. There will be a new lands advisory group. I honestly believe that we need to go back to some of the mechanisms in ANILCA that were in the statute in the early part of the 80s when ANILCA was passed, later extended by the Knowles administration. And it's about time that we get back down to a way that the federal government and the state government sit down in a much more practical way to determine what happens on lands in Alaska. I'm also watching very closely what's happening with other states where several western states have found a way to at least make the case to have more land transferred to the states. There's a bill that passed the House about a year and a half ago that changes some Forest Service land ownership in Oregon. Utah, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho are all working on a case to transfer more land. And that's not pie in the sky. The Yukon just got all of its crown land. The Northwest Territories got it April 1st of last year. Greenland has gotten it in the last decade. And I can guarantee you that these people will not be just tearing up the landscape. They will be working to make things happen. So I'm getting the high sign that it's time to hush up, but I will say this. There's 3 or 4 things that I hope to do as a private citizen to help move things along. And Alice, I hope, will talk about the Arctic Circle. I think it's about time that we did everything we could to get Arctic ports together to find the right mechanism to offer a shipping regime that's not just totally controlled by the Russians. And there may be an opportunity with that next summer. I'm a member of the World Economic Forum effort on the Arctic. Lawson Brigham, who you heard earlier today, is there, and we're working on an inventory of Arctic investment opportunities to show the world that we're an emerging market. We're also working on principles of investment to make sure that anybody who's coming in has kind of heard from Arctic residents on ways to invest sustainably. I think we need to avoid a refreeze, and the WEF group is also looking at how some of the geopolitical issues. I don't think I abhor what Russia's doing in Ukraine. But at the same time, they're our neighbors, and we manage the same fish, and we have the same search and rescue necessities, and so we've got to work together there. And I'm also very proud to be working with a number of clients and working with Platinum Capital on new mechanisms to bring investment to the Arctic. And because there is a huge opportunity for, as the President said in his State of the Union speech last week, for public-private investment on things like roads, on things like ports, on things like icebreakers, even on things like airships. And a private equity fund is one effort that we have that can bring cross-border investment into the Arctic and do it sustainably. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the panel, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Mead. Mikå? I love the red shoes.
Well, I'm half French, half American, so I'm supposed to have red shoes by nature, right? Hello, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Rachel, for having me today. I'm not Alaskan, so I'm glad that non-Alaskan people can also talk at the Arctic Encounter Symposium. And I would like to thank Alice very much because thanks to her and President Grimson, actually Rachel had the opportunity to spot us and our research at the latest Arctic Circle conference, so thank you too. Well, I'm not going to teach you this. This is 2015, right? Can I take you back in time for a second? 20 years ago, so 1995, my father offered me my first computer. So its operating system was basically Windows 3.1. I used to have video games, on these little IBM flash drives of 1.44 megabytes. Well, that was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the euro did not exist. Finland, Sweden were not even part of the EU. They were just joining the EU in 1995. There was no tunnel back then between London and Paris. It was just built at the end of 1995. Nunavut did not exist. The Greenlandic self-government did not exist. Kim Kardashian, Gordon Ramsay, all these people did not exist. The Spice Girls did not exist. Well, they did, but you know what I mean. Back then, China and India were not part of the world's 10 largest economies. We were only 5 billion people then. I was 6, so I was one of the youngest. But right now, we are more than 7 billion on Earth. The world's average primary energy consumption per capita was 19,000 kilowatt per hour. Now, in 2014, well, if you allow me this digression a little bit, it was around 25,000 kilowatt per hour. In 2031, it will be 32,000 kilowatt per hour. Between 1985 and 2010, dozens of trillions of dollars have been invested in air, land, and sea infrastructure. It was a G1 world back then. It was an American world. Right now, we are in the G0 world. As you know, China is now the world's largest economy. So we're here today to talk about the Arctic, but I had to make this introduction because at POLARISK what we do is what Americans call actually predictive analysis. So our analytical time frame is the year 2035. We are the only consultancy in the world right now working with a pan-Arctic and a double Arctic-Antarctic perspective on polar affairs. And so what are we going to be talking today is, well, I mean, put it this way. Let's avoid the Fukuyama syndrome. What I call the Fukuyama syndrome is basically thinking that in 2015 we are at the end of history. We're definitely not at the end of history, and that's exactly what Edward Eda said this morning. It was fantastic speech. And in 2035, the world will be just as different from 2015 as 2015 is different from what the world was in 1995. In 2035, so we'll be 8 to 9 billion humans. Each and every one of us will consume a lot of energy, I've mentioned it. We'll take the world's GDP from $81 trillion to $210 trillion, depending on the estimates. That's an average estimate, sorry. In the Arctic, we'll take what we call the gap at POLARISK, the gross Arctic product, from $620 billion to $2.1 trillion on 20 years. Of course, this is based on 2010 US dollar purchasing power parity, if you want to get into the details of our studies. And at current trends, China's annual military expenditure will match that of the US in 2035. In 2016, so next year, it's going to be only half of the US total military expenditure. Last week, the Beijing municipal government announced that it would pay for the so-called New Silk Road, you know, this train line connecting Beijing to Moscow. The estimated bill is 242 billion USD, and the journey would take 48 hours. Okay, fantastic. A few analysts, especially those in DC, have said that, well, this New Silk Road train line would actually hinder the development of the Northern Sea route or the Northeast Passage. Actually, what we see is that it's not going to happen. These two different routes will generate their own markets, first of all, and the two markets will be complementary, but the two markets will actually fuel each other. So that's an interesting thing when we talk about the Arctic. At the same time, so last week, America was still debating whether or not to order new icebreakers and to deal in the coastal plain of Alaska. That's interesting because that's a discussion that started back in 1995 when President Clinton vetoed the GOP bill back then. So is America falling behind in the Arctic? Well, not exactly. Not exactly. The problem is, when considering the plans that America's allies and contenders have for the Arctic, it's easy to figure out that the coming 2 years are make or break years for the US in the Arctic. And I'm sure that Alice will be maybe tackling on that issue. So the US won't chair the Arctic Council again until 2031. So back then, when it happens, 2031, it will be too late to drive any kind of change then. When the US assumed the Arctic Council chairmanship again for the 2031-2033 period, we will have already entered the Arctic booming era then. And so what will happen to America in the Arctic? Well, it's fairly easy to imagine what are going to be the Arctic geoeconomics in 2035. when we think about the Arctic will see two kinds of structural development phases. The first one is the Arctic construction era, and the second one, starting 2030 or so, will be the Arctic booming era. So the Arctic construction era for a second. So it's the phase that we've been in since 1995 or 1990, since the Berlin Wall fell, if you want. Many things have been built in the Arctic. When I mean things, I mean institutions, the Arctic Council, the Northern Forum, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Eurobarents, the Arctic Economic Council, Norwegian North Council, so many institutions. You have macro-social constructions as well. Where is the Arctic? What is the Arctic? Who is the Arctic? South to north dynamics versus circumpolar approaches. Subarctic versus near Arctic. Arctic branding, gateway cities, all these kind of things are things that were constructed in the past 20 years. You also have micro-social constructions. So food security, health, sanitation issues, housing, education, and so on and so forth. You also have ethical constructions. For example, last year, the hashtag hunt seal, wear seal, eat seal was a big thing in American policy because a lot of people were random people were just discovering what the Arctic life was. Of course, when it comes to ethical constructions, Mead mentioned it, the N-war issue, of course, is one. You can find also the mass labor imports management issues in Greenland, for example, large-scale tourism. Well, beyond that, you also have regulation building. So, of course, the continental shelf extensions, the delimitation of Arctic regions within the Arctic countries, ENP permits, specific Arctic regulations and requirements such as the Polar Code that was discussed this morning, Arctic Ready standard certification programs, and so on and so forth. These are all soft infrastructure building. They require investing time and money in policymaking, in diplomacy and stakeholder management and engagement, and in general science. And then we have hard infrastructure, the core topic of our session right now. So in the Arctic, we would need energy plants, energy grids, port terminals, airports, communications, cities, hospitals, water networks, you name it. And so what's interesting is that hard infrastructures require political will, first of all, effective and attractive investment vehicles to make it happen, and target science programs aimed at research and development, on the one hand for market predictability, so that's what we do, and for product research development specific to the Arctic on the other hand. That's what we don't do, right? So right now I'm not going to be talking about voter groups, just schools of thought in international relations. So functionalist and neo-institutionalists, liberals, as we call them in IR, they argue that soft infrastructure building and economic demand are prerequisites to hard infrastructure building. They claim that Arctic investments in hard infrastructure cannot be sustainable if they are not grounded within a favorable Arctic institutional framework first, and if they don't respond to a pre-existing or emerging demand second. At POLARISK, we come from the constructivist school of thought. What that means is that our argument is that investment in polar hard infrastructure actually drives polar soft infrastructure building. So what that means is the following. We argue that when a market transitions from frontier market status, like the Arctic or the Antarctic today, to post-frontier market or even emerging market status, concepts such as institutional frameworks and demand are socially constructed phenomena driven by the market's own needs. And so we argue that these socially constructed phenomena are driven by hard infrastructure requirements rather than by soft infrastructure ones. So let me rephrase this if this is not clear. It is political will and investments in market predictability and in research and development that can turn a frontier market into an emerging market. So a very straightforward contemporary evidence to support such claim. You can ask me, well, Antarctica is one, but maybe I should save that to another conference. In the Arctic, many territorially grounded evidences support our claim. Well, the Alaska's North Slope is one. And today, Yamal, Greenland, Yakutia, Lapland, Iceland, and even some non-subarctic territories like Maine, Scotland, France's Normandy region, Poland, South Korea, even Singapore fall into that category. So functionalists and neo-institutionalists will argue, okay, so how do you explain the interest of so many states for a seat as observer at the Arctic Council? Well, the answer is quite simple. It is precisely because there is political will at home and an emerging or existing demand to go Arctic from home. For instance, when Singapore, India, South Korea, and Japan applied to become observers, they sought market predictability information. Now that they have gained access to the Arctic Council, so now that they accessed the information and some kind of Arctic respectability, they are developing very effective stakeholder engagement strategies to support their geo-economic agenda in the Arctic, or for some like China or Russia, their geostrategic agenda as well. So conversely to what some think tanks like CSIS or The Economists could argue, The Economist is not a think tank, granted, but you get the idea. At the circumpolar level, these two structural phases, so the construction and the booming eras, are not impacted by conjectural issues such as short-term prices or Russian sanctions. Put differently, if Western investors wanted to stop investing in the Russian or Canadian Arctic, well, that doesn't mean that Chinese, South Korean, or even Indian investors would stop doing that too. So that said, with all that said, what is to expect from the US Arctic Council chairmanship? How does this short 2 years fall into this structural analysis? Well, it's simple. I'm going to go fast. If the US Arctic Council's chairmanship can have an impact, if it can chart a path towards a sustainable Arctic development, well, the US, if they want to achieve that, they have to focus on accelerating the building of the Arctic superstructure rather than managing conjectural issues or solely focus on developing the Arctic Council as an institution or as a standalone institution. So said differently, the US Arctic policy must have a vision that goes beyond institutionalism, and I'm going back to Mead's point earlier. It must focus on the long term rather than being polluted by short-term economics or politics. I'm not a diplomat, so I can argue that the Canadian chairmanship was polluted by such things. The US Arctic policy must be resilient, if you will. Stick to the vision, right? So for the 2017-2019 period, as you know, Finland will adopt a very strongly business-oriented agenda so as to impulse change in the Arctic, in its own Arctic, but across the Arctic. And I don't know if you know that, but Finland already brands itself as the only Arctic territory, the only Arctic country whose territory, the whole of it, is north of the 60 degrees parallel. Well, actually, it's not true, because if Greenland is a country, they also have that. If Iceland is a country, and I think it is, they are also above the 60th degree. But it's a matter of branding here. And if the Prime Minister Alexander Stubb, wants to make of Finland, of the Arctic, Finland's innovation hub, and of Finland, the Arctic's innovation hub, well, that's going to be made easier because, as you may not know, or know, I don't know, the former Prime Minister from Finland, Jyrki Katainen, is actually right now the EU Commission's Vice President responsible for economic affairs. And as this morning, Finland is, the EU will adopt an economic Arctic strategy, a comprehensive Arctic strategy, in December 2015. So all these issues are kind of entrenched, right? So the US must get away from the typical DC drama, we've said it, and adopt Finland's approach. The US and Alaska must offer a vision for the Arctic if they really want to proactively drive the change in the Arctic instead of watching passively contenders gain Arctic market share and diplomatic influence every day. So it's not going to be an easy task because big picture economics for the 2 years to come are actually not that good. So frankly, firstly, because the Chinese bubble has entered a correction phase this past 18 months, slowing the global trade flows have slowed down. And secondly, because of geopolitical factors that traders and investors fail to address predictively, well, they end up caught into market panic movements. We could talk about Greece, the Greek issue within the EU. There are many other political issues that could pollute, as we said, the Arctic Council's chairmanship. But when it comes to oil and gas, especially oil prices, America must be very vigilant. It's not because oil prices have gotten down to $40 or $60 a barrel that there won't be a demand for going into the Arctic. At POLARISK, what we know, what we figure out is that at least 55% of all existing or planned hydrocarbon projects in the Arctic will go forward these two coming years. Companies such as Shell, Eni, Statoil, Rosneft, Gazprom, Lukoil, CNPC, PetroChina, Sinopec, Total, Novatek, PetroVietnam, Imperial, and Lundin will move forward in the Arctic this year alone. So I don't want to get into the ANWR debate. I think that many other people can do it better than I do as a French-American type of guy. But what I just want to say here is that we have to keep in mind that between $450 billion to $1.1 trillion worth of Alaskan extractable resources over 35 years would have to remain underground should the coastal plain remain off access to drilling. We can develop that figure and the rationales of that figure, of those figures later during the questions. So make no mistakes, fluctuations in terms of the interest in the Arctic market depends also and primarily on fluctuations of the Arctic Ocean's minimum sea ice extent, and I will conclude on that. In this regard, the Arctic Methane Emergency Group, so a group of international academics with links to Cambridge University, University of Ottawa, and many others, have published a paper this week. And they've said that there is a 20% probability that the Arctic Ocean will be ice-free during the summer of 2015. 20% probability. And there is, according to them, a 70% probability that the Arctic will be ice-free in the summer of 2020. In a 2012 document, the US Navy expected the Arctic Ocean to be ice-free during the summer of 2016, as you know. And NASA expects it to happen by 2035. Actually, there is a consensus on 2035 among the scientific community with regards to a sea ice-free Arctic. So in 2035, I'll be 46, right? So most of our partners and analysts at POLARISK will be in their early 50s or mid-50s. So we will all be then dependent on the strategies that would have been taken today. So I just wanted to mention that because between 2015 and 2017, all Arctic stakeholders, companies, countries, everyone will actually adjust their own strategies after the American one, after what America has done as chair of the Arctic Council. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope we can continue discussion during the questions.
Thank you very much, Mikå. With that, we'll hear from Alice Rogoff. Welcome, Alice. Nice job.
Thank you, Reggie, and thank you all for forgiving my tardiness. I stumbled onto a plane in Juneau at 7 this morning in the dark and fog, and I was so sleepy that I wasn't really noticing how late that plane was and therefore how late it was after we took off from Ketchikan. So I don't know what happened, but I'm here having had a few cups of coffee in the last hour. There are so many issues that are spinning around in all of our heads right now, we Alaskans, on the subject of Arctic because of what's come out of DC in the last few days, that I often find myself needing to step back further from a subject when more variables start to pound me simultaneously. I have often, in the last couple of months, found myself talking to East Coast friends who are in government, politics, media, about the subject of the Arctic, because at least now this year they might say to me, for example, gee, Alice, I'm hearing the word Arctic a lot more these days, but why do we really care? That's a typical question from a very senior, enlightened journalist with household name recognition. Let's just say that. So when I now try to formulate what the message should be from Alaska to the United States, I'm going to put aside the rest of the world, Mikå and others, don't be offended. My sense is that there is so much noise in the conversation between Alaska and Washington, D.C. right now about ANWR and Arctic offshore drilling and roads between King Cove and anywhere else that we are all losing sight of the need for some very, as I would call it, third-grade English talk about why this matters to the United States. I challenge you to ask anybody who you respect in Washington, D.C. to stand up in public and give an answer that they would feel politically and journalistically safe to give about why the Arctic is important to the United States now. They would either say it's for oil and gas, which they may or may not feel free to say because the rhetoric level on that has gotten to this absolute hysterical level, or they would say the opposite. It's because they're afraid of methane release, which then leads you right back into the oil and gas discussion. Or they would say something about Russia, which is so self-evident and also so useless as a motivating theory that you can't go anywhere with it. So here is, in a nutshell, where I come out, and since I find myself increasingly thinking that I'm in the messaging business, because that's what journalism feels like most of the time, I choose to give a talk that goes in, again, third-grade English terms, something like this. Now, bear with me, this is going to sound horribly dumbed down to most of you who know the subject. Once upon a time, there was what was not yet known as the lower 48 states. And a bunch of Europeans set sail and landed somewhere on what we call now the East Coast. And between the day they started arriving, putting aside the treatment of the indigenous people, but just in terms of the timeline of history, from those days in the 1600s until today, look what got developed on the East Coast of the United States, just in terms of GDP, East Coast GDP. And that's about a 1,500-mile coastline from Maine to Key West. Okay, put that thought aside. Look at what happened after the westward movement began. Again, putting aside the subject of indigenous people and who wound up where. We have a West Coast economy, as it's called. It starts about here in Seattle, and it goes down to Mexico. And we know how much GDP is there. Well, now today, with Arctic ice about to be a thing of the past, we, the United States, have a third coastline, which is, if anything, longer than what we think of as the East Coast or the West Coast. You all know this. Reggie lives on the coast. This is not a surprise to Alaskans, but I'll bet it's a surprise even to people who live in Seattle. We have been so conditioned by our equatorial maps and the weather maps that the television guys show us in the evening that we never think about the Bering Sea and the Chukchi and the Beaufort, all of which is the legal definition of the U.S. Arctic. Don't forget that. That coastline stretches roughly from Dutch Harbor to Borough, and there is, with all due respect to the coastal villages, virtually nothing on it. So think about how much we average television watchers know about the surface of Mars today, right? We've sent spacecraft up there and rovers and cameras, and we're examining the rocks. And it catches the public attention. How many people who think about the subject of Mars and the surface and whether there's water there are thinking about Kotzebue and Nome and Barrow and what's there? And my God, there are Americans who live there now. Then go to the geopolitical, unquestionable imperative. That's all right near the Bering Strait. The Bering Strait is this tiny little sliver of land, smaller, tinier than Panama. We know the shipping, as the Arctic Ocean becomes a year-round body of water, which it will with ice-enabled hulls, we know the volume of shipping that's going to go through the Bering Strait. But how many people, even in Alaska, know what has happened to the population of the village of Little Diomede, which sits in the middle of the Bering Strait? That village went from several hundred thriving people who lived on subsistence, whale, seal, walrus. I used to go there just 10 years ago and buy the most magnificent ivory carvings because they had more walrus tusk to do than they knew what to do with. As of now, that school is within one child of closing. Why? Because of benign neglect by the state of Alaska. We let that village suffer every trauma known to man: drugs, poor schools, the worst teachers getting sent there, principals who would have been rejected in any other village, no nursing capabilities whatsoever, and then, while we're at it, no transportation for sometimes weeks or months at a time because it was too expensive to land a helicopter there. Well, I just want you to think again. Suppose that village of Diomede were at the entrance to what would someday become New York Harbor. Would Peter Stuyvesant, or some other name you can conjure up as a smart person from our East Coast history, have taken that short-term view of what had to be present on a coastline for a port economy to be built? I don't think so. So I'm saying this in part to Mr. Fleener, who I don't mean to put on the spot, but to all of us here in this room. I think that the single most important thing Alaska and those of us who are here and who think about this issue can do is to stop screaming about ANWR and Arctic drilling. Those issues are beyond any one of our capability to influence. Even Senators Murkowski and Sullivan are only 2 votes in a Senate. And the emotions run so high on these issues right now that we have got to take a time out from screaming about it. But what we can do is make the Congress and this administration understand why, if Shell goes forward, there has got to be revenue sharing. Because revenue sharing would allow what Mead talked about, those public-private partnerships, to begin developing port infrastructure and a coastal economy on what I want you to think of as the third coast of the United States. Okay? I could show you this PowerPoint. I will do it very briefly, but basically it's just a series of maps. So for those of you who don't have the geography clear, it's this simple. There's Iceland, there's Dutch Harbor with the North Pole in the middle. That tiny opening right under the words Dutch Harbor, that's the Bering Strait. All of the coastline from just shy of the circular mark you see on the left, down to the big red dot of Dutch Harbor, is what we legally, under the laws of the United States, consider to be the Alaskan Arctic. That is not well understood. We know there is, to the extent there is any port infrastructure in western Alaska north of Dutch Harbor, it's in Nome. It is a shallow harbor for small boats. They'd love to dredge it and make it deeper. We don't know how quickly that can happen. The only place where there is natural deep water is in a place called Port Clarence, which you non-Alaskans have surely not heard of, but the Coast Guard knows it's there because they can drop anchor there with their deeper draft vessels. There's Little Diomede, all the same neck of the woods. Port Clarence is a pretty easy place from which to maintain watch over Diomede by electronic means. But imagine how much harder that will be when there are no Americans living in Little Diomede. Now remember, Big Diomede is inhabited by the Russian military. Wales, that village, I think today has about 150 people in it. So it's stronger than Diomede, but it's holding by a thread. You've got Reggie here from Kotzebue. Cape Blossom is a beautiful place for a port. I have no doubt it will be built in time. It won't be the deep draft port that Port Clarence can be because, again, the water is too shallow there. But as we begin to get a concept that there will be a system of ports through the Bering Sea, That will be one of the most important ones because there is already an economy in Kotzebue. And that is for many reasons. We can go into that later, but it's enough reason for there to be a port. Now you get down to an interesting place, the St. Lawrence Island, where you see the word Gamble. Gamble is 37 miles from the Russian mainland. There are people who live in Gamble who will tell you today that they see wrecked fishing boats showing up on their shores all the time. Well, that's because the Russians and probably the Chinese are out there right now doing everything they are not supposed to be doing. But we don't stop them because we don't have Coast Guard assets positioned there. Savunga, same thing. That has a halibut fishery. If we were ambitious, we'd try and develop that fishery because you can see just by where it sits in the Bering Sea that it's kind of in the middle of fishing channels and shipping channels, but we don't give it any help. So the halibut plant is hanging by a thread. Same down to Mikoriak and the Pribilof Islands, and of course, last but certainly not least is Point Barrow and the huge city of Barrow at the top. So that's the geography lesson. Just remember, from Point Barrow to Dutch Harbor is as long a coast as from Maine to Key West. And at that point, I'll stop because that's the end of my 3rd grade message. And if you all hear me saying that or writing about it, forgive the dumbing down, but I think we have to start with basics that people not in Alaska can grasp. Okay, thanks.
So this presents an opportunity for questions from the audience of the people who are on the panel. And mind you, I would just, before we get started with questions, take kind of collectively what was said. And as the Arctic, as you saw, is considered for development, whether it's onshore, offshore, oil, gas, energy, fisheries, minerals, whatever those commodities, assets may be. Picture, if you will, in the map of Alaska, that most all of those communities that were pointed out are not connected by road, do not have energy interties, have the highest cost of living probably across this country. And how would people benefit from all of this new infrastructure, educationally, economically, from a job, sustainability? How does the environment and the renewable resource withstand the pressure of the proposed development? And like Edward said during lunch, it's a fine balance. We understand those who would see development occur because we know what that means to us from an economic standpoint. We understand those who are looking out for the environment because we understand of being a steward, if you will, of the environment. And we walk that line in the middle. How can we walk in those two and accommodating the balance so that the people that Alice refers to can find a reason and a sense of self and a sense of worth? Because what we've seen, while there's been some development and some gain, and believe me, there still are communities that do not have the royal flush opportunities. in our areas and other parts of Alaska. So with that, I'll open up the questions. Please state your name and direct your question.
Good afternoon, Weston Howe, Luna Holdings Company. It's a complicated subject with infrastructure and investment, but how do we communicate to investors the simplicity of the issue is regardless of agenda or what you want to build, in the North Slope of Alaska, you're going to need gravel, and that gravel is expensive if you bring it out from other places, such as above $400 a square yard to meet FAA regulations to build an airport. So how do we communicate simply that before we put the cart before the horse, we need the simple raw resources to do that?
Mead, I can see you chomping at the bit.
Not chopping. Weston, let me just say that I appreciate what your firm is doing with the community of Wainwright to think about the future, because yesterday there were two announcements. One was essentially you heard earnings announcements from several major oil companies, and one of the questions was whether or not Shell intended to go ahead this summer, and Shell said that they do intend to go ahead this summer. There was also the announcement by ConocoPhillips that they might be holding back on the Greater Moose's Tooth issue, but still in their 33% reduction on capital spending because of lower oil prices, there would be other work being done in Alaska. And if what happens, what we expect and hope would happen this summer with Shell is that drilling in the Burger Field could reveal that there's 27 billion barrels of oil to be produced offshore in Western Alaska. If that happens, you're going to find this to be a driver for the kinds of ports which Alice talked about, gravel for ports and moving islands, other drilling capability and other processing capability, bringing pipelines on shore and pipelines to connect to the Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline, possibly gas pipelines in one direction or another to export natural gas. And indeed, I think we are looking at a situation where if Shell is successful, there's going to be major new investment. And what I think Wes is saying is what you've heard now a couple of different times, a couple of different ways, is that you're talking about a frontier where very basic things need to happen first to make these investments pay off. There will need to be gravel moved to have ports of refuge. There will need to be laydown areas as far south as Dutch Harbor and so forth to hold pipe. There will need to be icebreakers to make sure that we've got an emergency response capability, to make sure that we have the ability to enforce environmental rules. And there are these simple infrastructure issues that whether it's Shell's success or the growth of shipping, we have to somehow find a mindset that encourages investment in this region. So, very simply, if Shell is successful, I have no illusions. We're going to get into a big national debate on whether or not to produce what we found. But the fact is that it will be a driver for improving the facilities and the infrastructure in all of the dots, most of the dots on Alice's map, and many more.
Yes, Mikå.
Yeah, in terms of the mindset, just wanted to add something related to Shell. Shell basically said that in 2015, they would invest more than $1 billion again in the Alaska offshore. $1 billion is big, of course. It's fantastically, mind-blowingly big. But at the same time, when you know that the prize you're looking at is a prize of $700 billion of worth of natural extractable resources, what's 1 billion? So it's just a matter of what I'm trying to say here is we have to relativize. No, that does not exist. We have just to make sure that long-term plans, that people understand what long-term plans demand instead of focusing on the short term.
All right, I see another gentleman there at the mic.
Thank you, Jeffrey Lohman. Alice, I would say, first, take to heart what Mr. Treadwell said about inspiring the world when you write and talk to people in the lower 48 and tell them that Alaska is a place with people that aren't afraid of anything. because that's what I've
Amen.
seen in the state of Alaska more than anything. In 1994, you talked about in 1994, I was the same age you're going to be, Mikå, in 2035. Man, I'm old. and I was on the military liaison team in Lithuania. And I watched the last of the Russian military leave that country. And that was a good feeling, a really good feeling, because I didn't realize that Russia, before it was collapsing, while it was collapsing, after it collapsed, and right up until today and into the future, they were building icebreakers. And they have poised to dominate the Arctic with what I think is the most limiting factor today for the United States, and unfortunately for Alaska, is icebreaker capability. And on top of that, as you probably know, they recently purchased Arctic Helsinki shipyard, the shipyard that builds 60% of the icebreakers that are operating in the world today, and the shipyard that builds the best icebreakers in the world today. So my question is, a long way around to get to it, why can't we build an icebreaker? And why can't we build an icebreaker that will serve as a scientific research flagship, an icebreaker where a Coast Guard commander doesn't have to explain why it goes so slow to little singers and dancers that are on Soviet nuclear-powered icebreakers when they meet at the North Pole. An icebreaker that can serve as a command center for spill response if need be, conduct the rescue operations, catch the people that are wrecking ships and raping the fisheries that you talked about, Allison, that they're seeing in Gamble and other places in Alaska. An icebreaker that can do all of those things. Why can't we build that icebreaker?
I don't want to steal Mead's thunder, but I just want to say that there are an awful lot of discussions going on in an awful lot of well-decorated corporate boardrooms right now that I'm aware of, between financing sources and companies like Edison Schwest who are ready to build the icebreakers. So I don't think we see it publicly yet, but I'd be willing to bet you one of my little fingers that within 5 years that will start to happen. And because the ice is melting, we won't need as many of the sort of heavy-duty nuclear-powered types that Russia's built. We'll need more ice-enabled tankers that can make do with smaller escort vessels. Mead, over to you.
Let me just say first, our nation and Western nations together, as oil development happened in the Caspian Sea, bent over backwards in the last few years to make sure that pipeline routes of that oil out of the Caspian region were not going through Russia so Russia could turn off the tap. Yet the de facto situation today in the Arctic is that a basin that may have 30% of the world's natural gas, 13% of the world's oil, we're essentially saying to Russia, you are in control of making Arctic shipping safe. Now, there have been a number of us. Lawson Brigham, you heard from this morning, was head of the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment for the Arctic Council. We did a Council on Marine Transportation study on this. I've testified several times before Congress. I will tell you that the Bush Arctic policy was held up by a food fight on two issues, law of the sea and whether or not to say the word icebreakers, for a little over a year. The President Obama's Arctic strategy got us to actually kind of say the word icebreakers, and Brendan, I thank you for your work on that, but putting our money where our mouth is has been a big challenge. So I'm going to say there's a couple of different options. One is the public-private financing option that the President mentioned in his State of the Union on infrastructure across the country, where essentially what he proposed is that people invest in those kind of bonds are exempt from the alternative minimum tax. So he proposed a federal incentive to work on infrastructure investment. I've had some discussions with senior Coast Guard officials in the last 24 hours where they're looking at various ways to look at factoring the investment with a different kind of financing mechanism than just a straight appropriation to the federal budget. Congressman Young has put in a piece of legislation on that. The state of Alaska, under the last governor, said that we would consider ADA financing of icebreakers. When I have this discussion with my friend Lawson, he says, well, I don't think the job that you'll hear Admiral Abel talk about doing can happen very well on private vessels. We can have that debate, and we've got to have that debate. But whether it happens that way or we have a separate commercial service, similar to what the US and Canada have in the St. Lawrence, let's get on with that discussion. Because, number one, it's not in our interest to have Russia be in a situation where they are in essentially the reliability provider. It hasn't worked very well with the Trans-Siberian Railroad. It hasn't worked, we finally kind of have made it work with Polar Aviation, but I don't expect, and I think Russia should be involved, but I think making it multilateral would help reliability happen. And in the shipping world, you want reliability. So hopefully we can have these discussions in the Arctic Council process. Hopefully we can come to the table with a public-private investment issue. Alice mentioned Edison West. Shell had them build the IVIC. They've got 2 other icebreakers under construction. They lease 2 icebreakers right now to the National Science Foundation in Antarctica. There are other shipping companies that may have an interest as well. There is the opportunity for the United States to play a role in the Arctic and Arctic shipping, and I think ultimately public-private partnerships will make it happen.
We're running ourselves out of time here, and I see one more gentleman. If you can make your question very succinct, and we can get an answer, then we'll move on to the next panel.
Joe Hardenbrook with the Fairbanks North Star Borough. 2 years is not a lot of time, but what can we challenge the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council to show to America's Arctic inhabitants as deliverables, as things that we can accomplish during our 2-year chairmanship? As you know, communities, Fairbanks 36 below this morning, and we're tied with Beijing for the worst air quality right now because of the temperature inversions and the resulting cost of energy. Just what can we show to Alaskans as benefits from this chairmanship?
Well, as an extremely private citizen, I feel like maybe I'm very free to speak personally on this, and my message is simply, don't hold back. Don't let the U.S. chair of the Arctic Council be framed in terms of a mission to talk about climate change to the exclusion of everything else. And I have said this to Admiral Papp privately, so he knows I will say it publicly. I think that is doing a complete and total disservice, not just to the state of Alaska, but to every person who lives in the North. So issues like Fairbanks air quality, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of food security, and on the flip side of all the above, the lack of economic opportunity from those who will invest in this changing world are the way we Americans have to approach our chairship of the Arctic Council.
I concur definitely with this. And as a private analyst, I think I'm just as free as you, Alice, to speak as well, because what I'm going to say is hard-nosed analysis. What should be done is, as Alice said, not just focus on climate change. We can focus on innovation, like what Finland wants to do for its own chairmanship period. We can focus on NBICs, we can focus on water, we can focus on many stuff. And also there's another component to the Arctic policy that should not be overlooked, is the risk. The risk, the military risk, or the geostrategic risk. The previous question mentioned Russia's will to dominate the Arctic. Well, it's not really domination, it's a call for independence. And if you happen to read POLARISK's latest free report, so I'm not selling anything, it's just free, you go to www.arctic.consulting/top risks. We've issued a list of the 10 top risks that we see for the Arctic and Antarctic in 2015. And the top risk is Russia's militarization of the Arctic. But it's a risk not only to the US or to the EU or NATO, whatever, it's also a risk to Russia itself. Let me explain just this in a second, and then I'll pass on the floor to Mead. If Russia basically puts too much emphasis in militarizing its own Arctic, then it can just drive investors away from its own Arctic. So they should be careful about not making their militarization plan a risk for themselves, if you see what I mean.
Thanks for the question. Let me just kind of wrap up by saying there's close to 80 plus projects in the Arctic Council, and then you have the emphasis that the U.S. leadership will put on it. I guess a few highlights of things that I'm looking for or hopeful about. There's a project proposed by David Hayes, and there's the next Arctic Energy Summit, which will happen in Alaska in September. And frankly, there's a lot that we can learn together about energy and making energy available to people. There's efforts even with the current situation with Russia to try to make energy cheaper in Western Alaska. And let's use the multilateral discussion to help foster that. There's a lot that Alaskans are doing. We're the largest implementer of wind diesel in North America and maybe the world. We've got fantastic work going on at our university on microgrids in your hometown, and there's much we can do in that. A second on shipping. I think we have to pick up where we left off with the 2 binding agreements and do something more on oil spill prevention. We're just not covering it yet with itinerant vessels. And large number of the vessels coming through are going to be carrying oil, gas condensate, other things. So trying to get through, cut the Gordian knot of how do we get itinerant ships involved is something the United States could work on. One idea is to begin with a vessel traffic system in the Bering Strait. The U.S. could be leaders on this. If we can get to a multilateral discussion with maybe the Arctic Circle Ports Conference on a shipping regime model like the St. Lawrence, I think that would make sense. Fran Ulmer is here, chairman of the Arctic Research Commission. There is a lot that needs to be done in cooperation on Arctic science. And frankly, a science agreement, in my mind, would be a very useful output. The Canadians started on it. It's not going to happen in the Canadian chairmanship. A science agreement that guarantees access in the Arctic Ocean for science is so incredibly important. Right now, we've been turned back by the Russians many, many times, and as their claims go forward, and 45% of the Arctic Ocean becomes Russian exclusive economic zone, we're not going to be able to do the work that happens right here at the University of Washington without a science access agreement. So I would urge us to push for that.
Thank you, Mead.
And the last thing is what the Arctic Economic Council is doing what Reggie talked about and the Mayor talked about in terms of a local voice. It's dangerous in my mind that the State Department just threw the state of Alaska off the Arctic Policy Group in Washington. They say they're going to replace it with something better. I'm from Missouri so far on that issue, but we've got to make sure that the local voice is heard. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.